So again, how do you form these dural venal sinuses? And you can see right here, see the blue? That's one of them. The blue is there to represent venous blood. So the meningeal layer, as we said, folds inward. And I'm going to do that one in red. So this is the meningeal layer. And again, it would form a loop here. I don't know why your book didn't have that. Just like that. Now, at the bottom of this loop, there's an opening that is one of the sinuses. So here it's open, and then here it would be tightly adhered to each other, the two layers. And then another opening is here. So you can see there is the meningeal layer, periosteal layer forms like the roof, and that is another sinus. So these are both like tubes that will eventually lead out of the cranium and towards the heart. Again, this doesn't have the sinuses illustrated, but this one does. So this whitish, I guess, area here is the falx cerebri. So you'd have the two hemispheres of the cerebrum on either side. And then you can see on the superior edge of the falx cerebri, you've got a sinus, and then the inferior edge, you also have a sinus. Now the superior one is called the superior sagittal because it goes in a sagittal plane. Sinus. Again, sinus means space, but sometimes they're filled with things like venous blood. And you can imagine what this one's called. That is the inferior. Run out of room, but you get the point. Sagittal sinus. So think of these, they're going to run in a sagittal plane, dividing left and right halves. And the blood is going to flow down, in both cases, this way. So I'm going to draw some arrows. And then, actually, let's make the arrows blue. There you go. There, the blood's flowing down here. Now this area right here, that I'll do in red, this section is not part of the inferior. So the inferior sagittal sinus makes an arc, just like the superior. And then there's this portion here. That is called the straight sinus because it is straight. Unlike the inferior, unlike really all the rest of them, which are curving. So the blood's going to flow down the inferior into the straight and then down from the superior, and they're going to meet right there. Let me just review really quick. Whitish area is the falx cerebri, the infolding between the right and the left hemispheres. This is the superior sagittal sinus. The blood's flowing this way. A couple more arrows. And then this is the inferior sagittal sinus. Blood's flowing this way. Then the blood will enter the straight sinus and head to this point. So that's where the straight and the superior meet. And that point, you can see this is a posterior view. So this is the superior sagittal sinus. And you can see this point here. It would be like right deep to your occipital bone. That point is called the confluence of sinuses. Confluence means like, it usually refers to rivers, like two rivers that meet together, they're flowing down a mountain or whatever, and they meet here, right here, and then it's a big, even bigger river, keeps heading down a canyon or whatever. So that's the confluence where the two of them meet. So the confluence of sinuses is where the blood from the straight sinus and the blood from the sagittal sinus, superior sagittal sinus, meet up. Okay, then what? Well, then the blood, go down to this one. Once it hits the confluence, the blood's going to go either right or left, half right, half left, through these ones that go in a horizontal plane here. Those are called the transverse sinuses. So they're in a transverse plane. That should be SE. Transverse sinuses. And then there is this little one down here. You don't need to worry about it. It does exist, but we're not going to do it in this class. And then from the transverse, where does it go? Well, it's going to go around the corner like this. And it's going to go to this S-shaped area. So this S-shaped right here, that one is called the, nice arrow, sigmoid sinus. Sigmoid, maybe if you took geometry or, some mathematics refers to sigmoidal curves. It just means S-shape. That's what sigmoid means. And you can see this has an S shape. So that's a sigmoid sinus. I'm going to show you one more time on this drawing so you can see some things a little differently on this one. So there's the inferior, there's the superior. Okay, the inferior drains into the straight, which there it meets in the confluence of sinuses, and the blood will split right and left. And then it'll head to, oh, you can't really see the sigmoid there. It enters this S-shaped sigmoid sinus after that. Then where does it go? Well, you can't see it here, unfortunately. There is a foramen there that leads out of the cranium. And hopefully you remember this from when you learned the skull, as hard as that was. That foramen is called the jugular foramen. And, if you turned a skull upside down, looked at the inferior view of a skull, you'd see this hole. And the blood will drain through the jugular foramen, and then it's in your neck. At that point, we call the blood vessel the internal jugular vein. Okay. So I'm going to do just write down the names of all the sinuses and what drains into what. It's not going to be anatomical, but sometimes helpful, I think. You might want to draw this yourself or write it down. So the superior sagittal sinus up on the superior edge. And then you've got the inferior, and I'm going to be lazy, sagittal sinus. The inferior drains into the straight sinus. And then the superior and the straight both drain into this point. It's not really a sinus, it's just a point, a place called the confluence of sinuses. Then from the confluence of sinuses, it goes to the left and right transverse sinuses. And I will pause for just a second here and point out that L period, R period are standard for left and right. And there are going to be times in this class when you're going forward that you're going to have to indicate right and left. And that is totally fine if you just put L period or R period. Okay, and then from the transverse sinuses, they're going to go into the sigmoid. Obviously, the right's going to go into the right sigmoid. The left's going to go into the left sigmoid. And you're going to see I'm going to have to draw this around the corner. From the S-shaped sigmoid sinus, it goes through the jugular foramen to get out of the cranium. And then the blood, after going through the jugular foramen, would then be in the internal jugular vein. Again, oh, that's just a period. V period for vein. Yes, there is an external jugular vein. We will not learn it till Unit 4, so don't worry about it. So that would be the flow of blood. So blood is going to flow like this. They're going to meet at the confluence. And from the confluence, it's going to go to two arrows, left and right transverse. And then from the transverse to the sigmoid, through the jugular foramen, and finally to the internal jugular vein that will eventually lead to your heart. So the only reason I added these was just to think about terms. I'm not going to ask you about these. Well, first of all, what's this term? Hematoma. It's some sort of blood clotting or a bruise, that kind of thing. So this would be a collection of blood somewhere inside of the skull. Epidural. What does that mean? Well, you see the word dura there. Epi. We did have the word or the prefix epi when we were talking about like epineurium and epimysium. Epi means like on top of. So this is a situation in which the blood would be collecting between the dural layers is really what happens, between the periosteal and the meningeal layer. And there's a major artery there that's close to your temporal bone that if you get a blow from the side, sometimes that artery bursts and then blood starts collecting between the periosteal and the meningeal layer. So mainly what I wanted you to do is just point out the epi. What does that mean? Epi means on top of. Sub means below, like, I don't know, sub-basement. So below the dura, it's going to be somewhere below the dura. Probably could be on top of the pia mater. It depends on exactly where the blood vessel breaks. It's usually, there's like a big artery right here going through the brain that could burst, and this blood will start collecting. Really, it is going to be kind of superficial to the pia mater, but it can like infuse itself into brain tissue. That's really bad because blood is toxic. And we'll talk about the blood-brain barrier later that keeps, blood from directly touching brain tissue. Also, the pressure building from either of these, very bad. Your brain is tightly packed inside of your skull. So that's not great. And also, you're losing blood, which is never good either. Anyway, so subdural would be under the dura somewhere. And usually this one's caused by, say, a stroke, a blood vessel within the brain. This is a blood vessel that goes between meningeal layers. That's usually what happens. But really, all I wanted to do was point out to you epidural, subdural. Epi means on top of, sub means beneath. Oh, and you might have heard of epidural, like an epidural injection if somebody's in labor, going to have a baby. And yeah, they'll put medication on top of, quote, or it would be like superficial to the dura in the spinal cord, because you don't want to go all the way into the spinal cord or brain region with an anesthesia. You just want to deaden the nerves, not the central nervous system.